Russia's foreign minister is slammed at a UN Council meeting. Sergey Lavrov launched into a tirade against Ukraine at the session hosted by Moscow, but the West hit back, saying Russia's invasion struck at the heart of the UN Charter. And while diplomats exchanged words, fire was exchanged in Bakhmut as fighting for control of the city continues. I'm Yashni Padiachi, and today's newsmaker is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The war in Ukraine is well into its second year. The intense activities of the Ukrainian army's artillery units continue on the Donetsk front, while warplanes, helicopters, tanks and other heavy weapons clash in multiple other areas. On Tuesday in Kupiansk, Russia hit a museum, killing one person and injuring many more. All of this while world leaders were gathered at the UN Security Council meeting, trading barbs and trying to find a way out of this relentless war. Let's take a look.
On Monday in New York, Russia chaired a meeting on protecting the UN Charter. And in a tense exchange, it condemned Western sanctions and warned that the very values of the United Nations are under threat.
As was the case in the Cold War, we have reached a dangerous, possibly even more dangerous threshold. The situation has been worsened by the loss of and faith in multilateralism, as the financial and economic aggression of the West is destroying the benefits of globalization when the United States and its allies are abandoning diplomacy and demanding relations to be clarified on the battlefield.
While the UN says it's Moscow's invasion that's contrary to the United Nations mission.
We face unprecedented and interlocking crises, but the multilateral system is under greater strain than at any time since the creation of the United Nations. Tensions between major powers are at an historic high. So are the risks of conflict through misadventure or miscalculation.
The UN is working to save the Black Sea grain deal, which it brokered with Turkey last year, to allow the export of more than 27 million tons of Ukrainian grain from Black Sea ports. But Russia has signaled that it will not allow it to continue beyond May 18th, because a list of its demands have not been met. And on the battlefield, Ukraine is waiting for another kind of deal to kick in. As Kiev prepares for its spring offensive, it's launched an appeal for more weapons and ammunition. Last month, the EU reached a landmark deal to send 1 million rounds of ammunition to Ukraine, but disagreements among EU member states is delaying the delivery.
I understand those who want to see European military industry flourishing. Indeed, we need that. But if we delay, currently, Ukrainians might not push as far and as successfully as they could with our assistance. Therefore, speed is the main factor that we should be looking for now.
And Kiev is burning through more rounds than its allies can currently produce. In the years since the war began, Ukraine has multiplied its military spending more than 6 times to $44 billion. And has received massive amounts of aid from its allies. The battle for Bakhmut has been particularly relentless, described by some as the meat grinder.
The situation is tense now. The enemy is conducting offensive operations along the entire front line, mainly in the city. The enemy failed to succeed in encircling the city along the outskirts. It has now shifted all its efforts to the city.
Last week, Putin visited the Kherson region in the south, in the first trip to the area since Moscow annexed it last September, and his second trip to Ukraine's Russia-controlled regions since the war began.
Joining me now from Washington, D.C. is James Carden. He's a columnist for Asia Times and the former advisor to the U.S.-Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission at the U.S. State Department. Viktor Olevich joins us from Moscow, where he's a lead expert at the Center for Actual Politics, a Moscow-based think tank. And Iuliia Osmolovska is a former diplomat and the chairperson of the Transatlantic Dialogue Center in Ukraine. A warm welcome to all our guests. James, I'm going to start with you. We heard in that package that Vladimir Putin visited the front lines just last week. What was the purpose of his visit there?
Probably for domestic consumption, to show the people in Russia that the war is going their way. It's also speculated that the areas that he visited in Kherson, Zaporozhye, Luhansk are areas that might be the focus of a Ukrainian counteroffensive. So he was probably also there to listen to his military, people who were on the ground. So I think it was probably twofold.
And Victor, do you agree with James's assessment there of Putin's visit to the front lines?
A Ukrainian counteroffensive is expected in the next few weeks, in the next few months, probably by this summer, if not earlier. And it was, from the point of view of the Kremlin, it was important for Putin to show that Russia is going to defend those areas with all the military might that it has. It was an important visit from the point of view of the military detachments that are stationed in those areas. And as my colleague correctly pointed out, from the point of view of the Russian population, to show that Russia is there to stay.
Iuliia, and what are your thoughts on that? Because I understand you don't even think that that was Putin who was there. It could have been a double.
Yes, definitely in Ukraine society, there is quite a lot of skepticism about whether we saw original Putin on one of his doubles. But basically, it's not the most important part that I would like to underline. It's a Russian colleague said, actually probably by mistake, that Putin visit was to show that Russia is going to defend the land. So it's not about going into further offensive. And this actually the markets, the indication of the whole failure of Russian military adventurism in Ukraine that happened, started from last February. And basically we've seen already 8 phases of this war. And only the first one in March last year was relatively successful for Russians when they advanced into part of the Ukrainian territory. But all the others, it was like either a relative stabilization of the front or successful counteroffensive of Ukrainian armed forces or creeping occupation of Russia, which actually since November last year managed to occupy less than 1% of Ukraine's territory. So it says for itself that the expecting Ukrainian counteroffensive promised to make some big difference for the front.
And James, we had the Russia's Sergey Lavrov just yesterday at the UN Security Council, now headed up by Russia. He was blasted by Western diplomats, but he really stood firm that his country was not at fault here. Such sessions and comments from both sides, what do they actually gain in the now and in the long term? Because it's really nothing that we've not heard over the last 2 years, even more.
Yeah, that's right. I agree with you. Both sides seem to be dug in quite literally and figuratively. I think Lavrov's comments at the UN were actually aimed at what we in the West call the global South. And that would be kind of the non-aligned countries that actually have refused to go along with either side. And I think that it was an attempt to kind of shore up support among those countries, countries of the so-called BRICS, for example.
How much support does Russia have among the BRICS nations, those countries, of course, being the likes of Brazil, India, China, and South Africa?
Well, I think that they are trying to chart their own course, independent of the United States and independent of Russia. And indeed, over the past week, we've seen an effort by the president of Brazil to encourage a movement towards a negotiated settlement. And indeed, we've also seen efforts by French President Macron and his Chinese counterparts, who are allegedly working on some sort of peace plan. So the rest of the world seems not to be signing up for the NATO-U.S. Ukraine on the U.S. NATO-Ukraine side or the Russia side, and I think that there probably is a great deal of people out there who would like to see the negotiated settlement, a ceasefire, because of the knock-on effects of the war, particularly in Africa in terms of food prices. So, I think Lavrov's comments in the UN were probably aimed at that audience.
And I want to continue just on Lavrov's comments. Viktor, during that UNSC meeting, Lavrov continued to speak of the Nazi Kiev regime. Russia says that it wants to denazify Ukraine. It's one of the reasons it has given for the conflict there. But there are media reports of Russian neo-Nazi groups fighting for Moscow. So where does this talk of denazification come from? What's it all based on?
Well, the talk is based on the active involvement of radical right and extreme right-wing groups in Ukraine in the fighting, in not just in the past year, but in the past 9 years, since the coup took place in Kiev in February of 2014. Now, those groups have been effectively used by the government in Kiev for military purposes and other purposes. So if we are to be objective, we could probably talk about the Ukrainian government using those extreme right groups for its purposes on the battlefield and in internal politics and domestic politics. But Russia emphasizes that point as one of the reasons, gives that as one of the reasons for its special military operation. But what we see at this point is that neither side, neither Russia nor Ukraine, has the ability to reach their stated maximalist goals using military force. Ukraine, despite its numerous assertions to the opposite, cannot take Crimea. And it's unlikely that it will take the cities of Donetsk or Lugansk. Those cities are well defended. Crimea is populated mostly by Russians who want to be a part of Russia. And so it's quite unlikely that Ukraine will be able to take over those areas. Even if the counteroffensive that's expected, even if that counteroffensive is going to be successful for the Ukrainian side. Now, as far as Russia is concerned, the goals stated at the beginning of the military operation in February 2022 by Russian President Putin are probably also unlikely to be reached. Russia is unable to take over the Ukrainian capital. In fact, Russia has only been able to take over one regional capital, Kherson, last year without a fight, and then had to give it up to the Ukrainian side. So it's quite obvious that neither side is able to reach its stated goals by military force. And that means that sooner or later, this conflict is going to have to be resolved through diplomacy, through negotiations. And there are a number of countries, China, Brazil, that have already been mentioned, but a number of others, Turkey, some Middle Eastern countries, that have offered their services as negotiators, as mediators in this conflict. But at this point, since the United States and a number of its NATO allies are intent on seeing how the counteroffensive reveals itself, how it is implemented, those negotiations, those attempts at negotiations are a bit premature. So it is more likely that this conflict is going to last for probably for months more and possibly for years longer, unfortunately, for both sides.
Yes, unfortunately for both sides, indeed. And we're going to have a bit more of a discussion about a negotiated settlement that could eventually be reached. But Iuliia, I want to come to you because there's been a lot of talk about this anticipated counteroffensive from Ukraine that's going to happen in the spring? We are in spring now. How big could such an operation be? What could we expect from the Ukrainian side?
Yeah, in respect to our military officials, I would definitely not be commenting a lot about counteroffensive, especially I'm not a military expert on that. But let me just refer to the previous speaker and just to say that it is quite funny of someone sitting in Moscow talking about the radical groups in Ukraine, which had been in active combat force for 9 years already. So I'm a Kyiv myself, I'm half Russian, and actually my native language was Russian, used to be, before the full-scale invasion of Russia in February last year. And a lot of people like me thinking of these days like that. So what Russia achieved, actually, it's not destroyed statehood of Ukraine and destroyed identity, but actually with all your actions, you just strengthened Ukraine's identity. And coming back to expectations of the counteroffensive, I could agree that everybody is waiting for it actually to develop, and it's too early to see whether Ukraine is capable or not to win Crimea back. Just you see, let's wait for a couple of months to judge. But with regard to the expectations in Ukrainian society, let me just refer to the recent data of social polls, which shows that 97% of Ukrainians are confident that Ukraine will win this war. 74% of Ukrainians are confident that Ukraine can retake all its territories in 1991 borders by military force, and 87% of Ukrainians are not going to concede any part of its territory to Russia, even if the war takes longer. Given all these figures, it's very difficult to anticipate that our president will be stepping down and considering any issue of negotiations with Russia. And even recent remarks by some of Ukrainian officials that Ukraine could be considering or opening the page for diplomatic solutions when it reached the Crimea administrative borders had been met with the big resentment in the society, to the extent that the government officials had to actually comment that it was not something that they implied negotiations with Russia. So that makes all these kind of talks about negotiations obsolete at the moment.
But Iuliia, this war needs to come to an end. I mean, both countries and most of the world quite literally can't afford for this war to continue. So how does it come to an end? Is it either going to be on the battlefield, or do all the players have to come to the table to work out a plan to end this?
Well, it's very easy to ask the question, but let me refer this question to you. If someone would occupy your territory, would you be ready, and your part of your population will be suffering from all these atrocities, would you be ready to actually have this halfway settlement with part of the territories belong to a different country illegally? So I think that if this question is addressed to everyone, in every country, the answer would be similar to Ukrainians' one. So therefore, definitely right now, it's not the moment to talk about negotiations. If we're speaking about negotiations, it's the moment of ripeness of them, when both sides, as correctly was mentioned, should be ready to negotiate. And I deliberately put these figures of Ukraine's expectations right now just to underline that unless this phase of counteroffensive is over, and we can't project any developments of the scenarios before it is over. So basically we need to wait for a couple of months to see whether it would be possible for us to come at some point to negotiations.
Victor, can negotiations take place? What would Russia want here, knowing quite well there are going to have to be compromises?
Well, any negotiated solution involves compromises on both sides that may not be, some parts of which may not be liked by both sides. That's the nature of negotiated and to military conflicts. And so in this case, it's obviously when my colleague in Ukraine states that very high numbers, percentages of people in Ukraine are against negotiations and believe that Ukraine can win, similarly high numbers of Russians believe that Russia cannot lose and that it can fight and win. But that does not mean that those people who feel that way in Russia and Ukraine are correct. Those are very patriotic feelings on both sides during a military conflict. That's basically a standard situation in the first stages of military conflicts, when both sides feel they can achieve victory. But the reality on the ground is different. it's not possible. It's not, you know, Ukrainian troops are not going to reach Moscow, and they're not going to take over Russian command. And Russian troops are not it's unlikely that Russian troops are going to reach Kiev and to take over the Ukrainian capital. So again, there isn't going to be an all-out victory on either side, and negotiations, as I said, sooner or later are going to have to happen, and both sides are going to have to concede something. Now, it's unlikely, extremely unlikely, that Ukraine is going to officially recognize any of the territory it controls under international law as Russian. At the same time, it's very unlikely that Russia is going to recognize any of the territories that it now incorporated officially into its territorial body as Ukrainian. So a possible compromise may look like this. Ukraine may concede, may state that Crimea is a part of its territory, but concede that for some time that at this point it remains under the control of a foreign power, in this case Russia. And Russia may concede, may state that some territories that it now controls, or that it has not even controlled militarily, but claims as its own, that they are parts of the Russian territory, but they are under foreign control, meaning under the control of Ukrainian government. That may be possible grounds for compromise. So a lot will depend on the outcome of this counteroffensive and on the willingness, not just of the Ukrainian side, but of the United States and Ukraine's main sponsors, their willingness to come to the negotiating table with Russia, because this is a proxy war, and the situation is not going to be resolved without direct negotiations between Moscow and Washington.
James, Moscow-Washington negotiations do seem a long way off at this stage. The West has a lot of guns in this game, quite literally. How united, though, is the Western world in its support for Ukraine right now, knowing that this could be a very prolonged conflict?
I think that there are starting to be some divides in the West. I just got back from a trip to Germany. I think public opinion is beginning to sour on the war. Obviously, I mentioned before, French President Macron is working on a peace plan with his Chinese counterparts. And in Washington, it does seem as though there are some voices in the administration who are now publicly floating the idea of a ceasefire and ways to incentivize Kiev to get to the negotiating table. But that is going to be a very difficult task, given the fact that indeed it was their country that was invaded, and they feel that they are fighting for their very survival. But it does seem that there are voices in Washington now who are advising the president that as he enters a re-election campaign, that he may well be better off politically without this war on our agenda.
Yeah, one of those never-ending wars that the U.S. has been part of for a while now. Victor, one of the many results of this conflict has been shortages of basic foods, mostly affecting poorer nations. It also impacts Ukraine and Russia's pockets, though. The grain deal brokered last year by the UN and Turkey has been pivotal in somewhat securing foods for poorer countries. That deal ends on the 18th of May, and it is crucial that it is extended. But is all of that in jeopardy if the G7 bans exports to Russia as they've threatened?
Well, as far as the grain deal, Russia is unhappy about the implementation, the way this deal has been implemented, because of a lot of the Russian supplies that were supposed to be transported to African countries and to other countries of the global south have instead ended up in Europe, have ended up in the West, have flooded the grain market there. And so Russia is essentially demanding that the deal be implemented in the way that it has been designed in the first place. And of course, those negotiations have been taking place utilizing the offices of the Secretary General of the United Nations. Turkey has been playing a significant role in that process. But at this point, Russia is also unhappy about the Ukrainian side using those ports, especially the Odessa port, that has been a part of the grain deal, for military purposes. So Russia has been threatening to get out of the grain deal for quite a long time now, but has been extending that deal over and over again. There are two factors that, just very shortly, there are two factors that may cause Russia to get out of the grain deal. The first factor is the results of the presidential and parliamentary elections in Turkey. If Erdogan does not manage to hold on to power in Turkey, then the relationship between Moscow and Ankara may change in a negative way for Russia, and then Russia might reconsider its participation in the grain deal, even though it's not stating that openly right now, that as a reason.
Okay, Viktor Olevich, thank you so much for that. And James Carden and Iuliia Osmolovska, thank you both for speaking to us. And thank you for watching. You can follow us on Twitter. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Yashni Pariachi. Take care and goodbye.